The Manchester Chartist, Chapter 13. "I haven't enjoyed myself so much in a long time," Irene Rose confided to Michael O'Donnell. "Nor I, Rose. You dance a fine jig for an English lass." Daniel, with his son crooked in one arm and Bess linking the other, walked ahead down London Road towards Ardwick. Irene Rose had insisted they should all return to her home and meet her father. Michael had impressed her, and she felt sure he'd impress her father as well. At the same time, she wanted to round off Bess's special day in the best way possible. She'd purchased a present for her, but hadn't wanted to embarrass a friend in front of her workmates. As they approached the house, Irene Rose was surprised to see her father approaching from the opposite direction. "Where have you been, father?" "I've been over to see Josiah West. I thought I might let him know about the possible trouble facing him in his Ancoats mill, and remind him of his duty for his employees' safety." He smiled. "Happy birthday, Bess. Are you well?" "Yes, I've had a wonderful day, Mr. Etherow." "Father, can I introduce you to Mr. O'Donnell?" Matthew looked at the stranger, a twinkle in his eye. He stuck out his hand, recognising the union organiser. "The infamous Michael O'Donnell, I presume." "You presume right, so you do, Mr. Etherow. I hope you've heard nothing good about me. Miss Irene Rose has been telling me all about you, and if just half of what she says is true, I'm only too pleased to be making your acquaintance, and that's the truth of it." "Do you always treat your class enemies with such charm?" Matthew replied, his old eyes smiling. "If you're an enemy, Mr. Etherow, I wish you had more like you. I really do." Matthew shook his head. He could imagine the charming Irishman as a formidable foe or a stalwart friend. "Come on, let's all go inside and get out at cold. The wind's beginning to bite." They walked up the short drive through the small garden and climbed the steps to the front door. Matthew knocked, and they soon heard footsteps approaching. The door opened, and a young maid with a cheerful face stood to one side to let them in. "Good afternoon, Mr. Etherow, Miss Rose," she greeted them. "Good afternoon, Grace," Matthew replied with a smile. "Do you think you could bring tea, please?" He ushered them all down the corridor and into his library. A roaring fire greeted them. The room was square with a high ceiling, all the walls lined with well-stocked bookcases, save the one looking out onto the well-tended front garden and the green opposite. A polished oak table occupied centre stage. A dozen hard-backed chairs arranged around it. An oval mirror hung above the large, dent, black marble fireplace. "Come on, Bess, sit yourself down, and you too, Daniel and Michael." Daniel took a seat, as did Michael and Matthew, but Bess hesitated, looking around in wonder. "I think Bess would like to peruse some of your literature, father," Irene Rose said, linking her friend's arm. "Come on, Bess. Let's see what we can find that may be of interest to you." "Miss Rose tells me that you're a supporter of the 10-hour bill, Mr. Etherow, and you refuse to employ any children under the age of 12. Can you be telling me why is that?" Matthew gazed at him for a moment, a shrewd look on his face, which eventually creased into a smile. "Before I explain, I think we should all be on first-name terms, Michael. Please call me Matthew, and I have a feeling my daughter will be only too pleased if you call her Rose." He paused, and Michael nodded agreement. "My father was a devout Quaker. From being a young child he taught me all men were born equal in the sight of God, and should be respected and treated accordingly. He opened Gibraltar Mill, although it was much smaller in those days, and I, like my brother George, was put to work as an apprentice at the age of 8, in exactly the same way as his mill hands' children. We were expected to undertake the same jobs as the other children, starting as scavengers cleaning underneath the machines. Later, we became doffers, stripping the full spools from the spinning mules and replacing them with empty ones. In those days, the spinning room on each floor of the mill contained about 20 machines. The spindles on each mule were apportioned to a particular child. My father's overseers had instructions to treat the children with respect and patience, but later in life I visited other mills where they enjoyed no such goodwill. In those mills, woe betide the poor child who for whatever reason fell behind in carrying out its allotted tasks. The machine would be set going, and the child's fingers bruised, skinned and burnt with the revolving spools as it tried to catch up with his or her comrades, desperately trying to match the speed of the machine. I've witnessed overlookers beating youngsters unmercifully. I've seen them strike infants frequently, little girls as well as boys, worn out and half asleep. I've seen children struck with such force they were knocked flying off the stools on which they sat to steal a few moments' precious respite, hitting the hard, oily floor, and sometimes falling into the whirring spinning mules with catastrophic results. He looked into the Irishman's eyes. You know the barbaric conditions that appertain in most cotton factories as well as I do, Michael, if not better. There's more than one mill owner will face his God accused of child murder due to the cruel and wilful neglect of his workforce's well-being. Aye, if God wished to send an unrepentant sinner to the perfect hell, he'd condemn him forever to have the body of a young child and sentence him to labour for eternity in one of those manufactories as many a mill child labours today. Matthew nodded his agreement. Work in my father's mill was hard, but it wasn't as bad as most. None of the children were beaten, but the fact myself and my brother worked alongside them ensured we were under no illusions as to what they had to endure and the inhumanity of it. We were also aware, as we made friends with the children of our own age and visited their homes, which my mother encouraged, just how privileged we were compared to them. A hard day's labour often wore George and me out, but we had clean beds with linen sheets and good wholesome food in a beautiful home. Our young comrades lived in hovels, which were virtually impossible to keep clean. They enjoyed a poor diet, often composed of tainted food, and were always hungry. We had education, were waited on by maids, and lacked no creature comforts, whilst our friends had nothing in the way of any real comfort, not even the comfort of their parents, who were equally worn out through overwork and reduced to wretchedness. Yes, I know the situation all too well, but that doesn't explain why you should act in a way that is completely out of step with the actions of your peers, and many would say against your own self-interest, now does it? Matthew smiled, half turning in his seat. See that mirror over there, Michael? He nodded in the direction of the fireplace. I look in that glass every morning and try to see the young boy that worked in my father's mill in my own reflection. I remember those young lads and lasses I worked with all those years ago and wonder where they are now. All too many of them will be dead, decades before their time, and they will have died of hard, unremitting toil, of overwork and poor diet, and not one of them would have deserved such a fate. I'm determined my workers and their children should have a better future. You sound like a socialist. I've read the works of the utopian socialists, Saint-Simon and Fourier, and I've read and indeed debated with Robert Owen, the father of English socialism and of cooperativism. I've read many of John Doherty's publications. I aspire to be a socialist. I'm aware of the great advances as well as the disadvantages made by the introduction of the factory system. I'm aware of the tremendous wealth it has produced and the possible future benefits it offers, providing it's brought under control. He paused for breath. Today, no more than 500 people working with machinery in a mill produce the amount of wealth it would have taken over 100,000 to produce less than a century before. Yet the working people who produce that wealth live in poverty. It was they in the main who invented and produced the machinery that makes such colossal production of wealth possible, and they continue to do so. The owners of the cotton and woolen mills invent nothing and improve nothing, but employ millwrights and engineers to do so, just as they employ superintendents to manage their enterprises. Many of them never set foot in their mill. Where has the wealth, whose production once sustained 120,000 people for every 500 employed today, disappeared to, do you think? Into the bank accounts of people like you, Michael pointed out with a grin. Exactly, Matthew replied. He looked the union organiser in the eye. Try as I might, I can't in fair consciousness justify the situation we find ourselves in today, and that's God's honest truth. My friend John Doherty would agree with much that you say, Matthew. When he founded the Voice of the People, he wrote, "I want to better the conditions of the people, to have them stand erect and look boldly in the faces of their masters, and to tell them, we are not your slaves, we are your equals. We are one side of the bargain, you are only the other. We give you an equivalent for what we get from you, and we are therefore entitled to, at least, equal respect." I think he was right. At that point, a knock at the door interrupted them. The door immediately opened as Grace entered, bearing a tray with a teapot and china. Irene Rose walked briskly across the room to the maid's aid. "Here, child, let me help." She took the tray off the girl and placed it on the table. "You go and tell Coop to let you have your supper, Grace, and then you can retire to your bed if you like. I'll see to things for the rest of the evening." She looked across to a friend sat at the writing bureau, seemingly engrossed in a book. "Come and join us, Bess," she said, as she began to pour the tea, placing cups of the brew in front of Daniel, Michael, and then her father, before pouring one for Bess and then her own. Matthew took a sip of his before returning to his conversation with Michael. If John Doherty had only said that, I'd have accused him of being a typical moderate trade union negotiator. But he went on to say, "Whoever opposes the present system will be the object of a tax. I will persevere to oppose it in whatever situation I may be placed. I am so convinced of its injustice that the idea of those who create all receiving scarcely anything is so monstrous that I can never be persuaded to remain quiet as long as the system exists." He smiled at Michael, who seemed surprised to learn the mill owner was familiar with the statement. "He was quite right," Matthew added. "The fact is, the modern production process is essentially a social process. A cotton or woolen mill, an engineering factory, or a railway for that matter, can't function without planning and cooperation between all those involved, and I see no reason why its product, namely profit, should not be owned socially and used to benefit society as a whole. The present situation, where profit becomes the private property of a privileged few, who happen to have inherited capital in one form or another, be it through the chance of birth, as in my case, or in the case of people like the barber Arkwright, through the blatant theft of other people's inventions, is unjustifiable. It's a form of legalised robbery." Michael nodded, whilst Daniel remained quiet, not quite believing the message his ears were delivering. Bess often made similar points to him, but the last thing he'd expected was to hear the mill owner confirming her arguments. Matthew took up his thread once more. "Everybody should be required to work by hand or by brain, or preferably both, and each benefit only according to the results of their labour and productivity, with the sole exceptions of the young, the elderly, the sick and infirm, who have a right to demand help and protection from the rest. That's my considered view, Michael. Production should be organised in such a way it meets human need instead of satisfying minority greed. We need cooperation, not competition." Bess, who'd now joined them at the table, although their conversation had not escaped her attention, glanced at her employer, blowing across the top of her cup as she did so. "Those aren't fine words, Mr. Etherow, but words don't fill empty bellies, do they? If they did, we'd all be eating newspapers, excepting they'd increase the 4p stamp duty if us did." Daniel looked at his wife, shocked by her intervention. Michael O'Donnell looked on in admiration, whilst Irene Rose smiled, awaiting further developments with keen anticipation. "Bess, we aren't Mr. Etherow's guests," Daniel admonished. "Nay, Daniel, Bess has every right to speak her mind," Matthew intervened. "Please make your point, Bess." "I've listened to all they've said with much interest, and I must admit I agree with every single word." She smiled and locked onto his eyes. "But what would thee say if I were to tell thee thine operatives are about to petition for less hours and an increase in hourly wage rates?" "You want to work less hours for the same wages?" "Of course. We cannot exist on less cash." "You're quite right. I don't think you could." He took another sip of tea. "I'm surprised you've taken so long to come to this decision, Bess Ackroyd. I suggest the operatives draw up a petition with Michael's assistance. Present it to me and we'll take it from there. I promise I won't reject it out of hand. I'm sure that together we can reach a solution." The mill owner's daughter laughed and gave her friend a mischievous look. "Make sure your demands don't suffer from the sin of false modesty, Bess," Irene Rose advised. "The time's long past for you workers to remain content with crumbs from the rich man's table. You should be after the bakery, and nothing less, according to what my father's just said, and I, for one, have every confidence he speaks the truth."